So this whole question about the perceived rarity of blue, it kind of depends on what system you're operating in. If you're operating as a terrestrial observer, then blue does seem to be somewhat rare. Certainly in mammals, aren't that many blue mammals. There are the blue men, though, that act in Vegas, so it's not like there are no blue people. There are a lot of blue birds, though. So I'm going like, well, why would there be more blue birds but fewer blue other things? And I have absolutely no idea. So we're just going to leave that subject and go into an area I know more about, which is blue in the ocean. And blue is actually fairly common in at least some parts of the oceanic ecosystem. So my name is Milton Love. I'm a research biologist at the Marine Science Institute, University of California, Santa Barbara.
There's a lot of fish that have blue. There's tons. Fish and invertebrates in the ocean. Blue is a very good color to be in open water organisms because that allows you to camouflage. So there's many that will have a light blue tint. Many jellies will have a light blue tint if they're pelagic jellies. So they blend in with their background. I'm Michelle Paddack. I am an assistant professor at Santa Barbara City College and lead scientist with One People, One Reef, an organization that works in Micronesia, and senior scientist with Oceanic Society. So if we're talking about the open ocean, where there's nothing to hide behind, you want to blend into the environment. And so being a color that allows you to blend in depending on what depth you are, so depending on what the light is like there. So in the very surface waters, we tend to have open water organisms that are clear or light blue. And as you go deeper, you start seeing deeper pigmentation so that organisms will blend in with a little bit of a darker environment. So you'll start seeing darker colors moving towards black. And then right kind of in the mid, you'll see organisms that are countershaded. So their tops will be darker colored so that if you're looking down at them, they'll blend into the darkness of the deep sea, but if you're a predator looking up at them towards the light of the sun, their silhouette will get erased by being a light color, so usually a white color or lighter blue, depending on the depth. Once you get into the deepest parts of the ocean, where no light penetrates, then you have this interesting scenario where the pigment is relatively irrelevant. And then in really deep sea, you'll often see these funny unpigmented organisms that just look hilarious, like the blob fish, it's just kind of flesh colored. There's no pigment in it because it doesn't need it. But what's cool then is that they start to rely on light to be the calling card. And so they'll emit different colors of light to then color themselves or attract.
One of the areas that we see blue in the shallow waters is the blue spots that are found on juvenile Garibaldis. Garibaldi adults are bright orange and have no spotting at all. They're just solid orange or orange-red. Garibaldi are the state of California marine fish, and are really disgusting and loathsome animals. They're extremely territorial and will hold territories on a reef, and they will drive away anything that enters into that territory. And this includes fishes that are many times larger than them. They don't have really any defense mechanism, but they have these teeth in their throat that are kind of like pavement stones, and they grind them together, and it makes this kind of clack, 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 clack sound. And that's enough to drive away virtually anything that comes into their system, other than harbor seals. Harbor seals view that clacking as before dinner entertainment. But the juveniles have bright blue spots. The bright blue spots are a way of the juvenile telling the adult, hey, you know what, I'm just a kid, and I'm not sexual competition for you, and if you persist in driving me off a reef, I'm going to get eaten by an angel shark, and there will be no next generation.
Why would you want to be blue? For any organism, any animal, the question is this conflict between, I do not want to get eaten, but I want other members of my species to see me and recognize me so that we can make babies, right? And so there's this conflict of being noticed or unnoticed. So it depends on which ecosystem in the ocean that we're talking about. And so on coral reefs, the diversity is so extremely high. There'll be many, many species. And so there it becomes really critical to show who you are. And so that's why coloration and pigmentation becomes so much more complex when you look at tropical fish and you see all these insane and beautiful patterns. And that's really about identifying yourself to your own species as well as confusing predators. So there's all sorts of pigmentation that is specifically adapted to confuse a predator as to which way you're looking or facing or how big you are.
Color can serve various communicative functions. And bright colors, reds for instance, are often used as warning. One species warning other species, either I am dangerous, look, I'm red. Or my eggs are dangerous, look, they're brightly colored. There is a species of sculpin, the cabezon, which is a reef species, and the females lay eggs on rocks. Male then fertilizes them, and they can be bright blue, and they are very, very toxic. This toxin is so powerful, at least to mammalian predators, that if you go up to British Columbia, cabezon will lay their eggs in the intertidal zone, in tide pools, and as the tide recedes, the adult male, which was guarding it, will leave, and the eggs will wind up high and dry. And you can see ravens walking around the intertidal, and you can see minks, and they're all looking for stuff to eat, and they will leave those eggs alone. How toxic are they to mammals? Well, at least to humans. The classic story is that of Carl Hubbs, who was an ichthyologist at Scripps, who wrote a paper back in the 50s about eating cabezon eggs, knowing full well that there might be something wrong. And the paper was basically, well, we cooked them, and I ate the eggs, and soon after I threw up. And soon after that I had diarrhea. And then I threw up again. And then I had diarrhea.
Our local species of octopus can give you a fairly nasty bite. It's not deadly in any way. They don't have a toxin that will hurt humans. However, the blue-ringed octopus down in Australia has a very toxic bite, one of the most potent neurotoxins we know of. My name is Paul Valentich-Scott. I'm a curator of malacology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. Malacology is the study of mollusks, and I specifically study marine bivalve mollusks like scallops and mussels and oysters and clams. if you pick up an octopus, they're smart animals. They know they're in distress, and they will definitely bite you. So they do have a beak, kind of like a parrot beak. So that's maybe a good way to think about it. If a parrot bit you, it would be painful, and it's a similar kind of bite. They'll also use all their suckers and arms to try to get loose or follow you up. So it's best to enjoy an octopus in a tide pool situation and leave it there and be fascinated by how quickly it moves and how unusually it moves, and the flashing colors that it can do, but not really pick it up.
Should you poke it?
I would never recommend poking an octopus. It's not good for the animal, and it actually starts inserting humans into a really important ecosystem where we don't belong. We certainly forage in tide pool areas and have for millennia, and maybe that's a way to think about it. But just leave the critters there that you're not going to eat. Blue-ringed octopuses, like actually some of our local octopuses in the Santa Barbara area, can flash these blue rings. And this is done with chromatophores, a rather complex system of smoke and mirrors in a way. So these are constantly changing depending on the animal's feelings at the time, if you want to say that. Cephalopods have very large brains, and they're able to take in a lot of information, and they can actually mimic the environment with these colors.
Anyway, in looking at cephalopods, they have in their skin chromatophore cells that contain pigments, and these cells can expand or contract to give you color patterns in the body of that animal. They're like micromuscles that are stretching the chromatophore cell. Usually you'll get like a little pinpoint when it's contracted. As it begins to expand, then the pigments are moved out in a bigger pattern, so it's much easier to see. It's usually much darker. We then moved on a little bit to looking at the color that was being produced by iridophores. And the iridophores are the ones that are really reflecting cells. They're only found in shallow water octopuses, and they are primarily set up to reflect blue from sort of the skyline. I was trying to understand, as I began to learn more and more about octopus identification, what was going on in the skin, because that had not been used really as a means of telling different species apart. There are two sort of medium-sized octopus here, Octopus bimaculoides and bimaculatus. And in the past, they had mainly been separated based on egg size. We then started looking at skin patterns, and those were different. But we then got focused on the blue rings, and in these animals, there are two large false eye spots. What you need to do is look at the eye spots more closely, because bimaculoides has little rings of blue that wrap around in the dark chromatophore background. In bimaculatus, it's a base little ring, but with branches coming out of it. My formal name is Frederick Hochberg. I'm a junior. My father was Fred, so everyone called me Eric. And I grew up on Catalina Island. when I was about a year old, we moved to Catalina, so I went all the way through high school there. It was a wonderful place to grow up then because there were only about 600 people that lived on the island in Avalon. And
how big was your high school class?
11. Yeah, it was amazing. And it was one of those situations where all the families knew each other. And if I was off and it was dinner time, my mother always knew who to call to get me sent home. I could walk to school and go for a swim every day, and I just loved it. And there was the captain of one of the glass-bottom boats that sort of took me under his wing and got me into snorkeling and then diving and then collecting shells. And that sort of got me very interested in marine biology, which is then what I ended up majoring in when I came to UCSB. We think that with the false eye spots, that is probably something that protects these animals when they're on the bottom during daylight hours. And if there is like a predator coming around, that they can camouflage themselves into the bottom and then flash these false eye spots that give the appearance that the eyes are much bigger, much farther apart, so that this animal now must be much larger to scare off the predator. Now, there is another genus of octopus called Haploclena that is covered with blue rings on the body or blue stripes on the body. They are small animals compared to the medium-sized ones we have here. They can flash these blue rings. And it's almost sort of a warning signal to other related species that are in the area. The other story that another colleague of mine thought was, it may not be something you use for warning other animals. It may be something you use if you're a male coming up to a female, flashing those and say, you know, I got bigger rings than my buddy close to me, so, you know, I'm the one to take. My favorite blue? Well, it might be the ocean. You know, we often take the dogs down to Goleta Beach, and I can sit in the car while my wife walks the dogs, and I love the view and looking out over the island and the blue sky. And I haven't been able to find a blue doggy. They don't have blue hair that I know about.
There's some that have blue eyes, I think.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I would say my favorite blue is probably the blue of some of our local dragonflies and damselflies. For example, the blue-eyed darner is a beautiful dragonfly that you can see in local creeks. My kids love to look at them. You can watch them flying around in the air with the light shining on them, reflecting their blues beautifully. The males are blue, the females tend to be a more drab brown. When you see sexual dimorphism in nature, you should assume that it has to do with sexual selection, and that females are choosing males, and that more brightly colored males are brightly colored to be attractive to females. They might be more attractive to predators as well, so there's a cost to that beautiful coloration, but the benefit in attracting mates outweighs the cost of being attractive to predators. Females of these species, as we've talked about, this is sexual dimorphism, so they're drab. Why are they drab? Well, they have the predation pressure without the sexual selection pressure. They don't need to attract the male mates, but they do need to protect themselves from predators. So there's selective pressure on females to be a more subtle color that blends into their environment. It's traditionally thought, and many studies have upheld this view as well, that males need to attract mates because sperm are so prevalent and they are cheaply produced, and there are billions and billions of sperm present in many males just ready to fertilize eggs, whereas eggs are precious resources. They represent a much higher investment per egg, if you're comparing it to sperm, on the female's part. Because the females are investing so much more in each potential offspring from the very beginning, they should be more selective with respect to who they mate with. Whereas males can really afford to mate with any female that will agree to participate in that. This leads to a dynamic where you get often choosy females in nature that will compare males based on some kind of trait. It might be their size, it's often their color or decorations or behaviors, and it's thought that these signals that the males are giving need to be honest signals. So if a male is brightly colored, that means that he is a healthier, stronger male, and he is able to be brightly colored, which is often a cost. It means he's investing energy into producing a coloration instead of putting that energy into fighting off parasites or putting that energy into trying to get away from predators. And if he's able to incur that cost and be that beautiful, then he must be a pretty great male. My name's Jennifer Maupin. I'm a professor of biology at Santa Barbara City College, and my background is in behavioral ecology. I have a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. If you have a species where males and females are both brightly colored, you can guess in an educated way that there's not a very high cost of bright coloration in that species because the females are doing just fine and they don't have to be pretty unless, hey, here we go, in some species there's a sex role reversal. Sometimes the males are actually choosing the females, so you'd have to consider that as well. But take something like our local scrub jay, for example. Males and females, they're not that different from one another, not in the way that you would say, look at the sexual dimorphism of, if you're familiar with northern cardinals, the males are very bright red, the females are kind of a drab brown. Western scrub jays, they're bluish gray, males and females. These birds aren't incurring a big cost by being blue, and they're large birds, they're very smart birds, they're crafty birds. They're doing okay with respect to predators.
Parrotfishes are sort of the master example of artistic palette in the ocean, and they vary between when they're juvenile and male and female will be distinct from each other. And they sex change. So most of the parrotfishes will start out their life as a female, and then in territorial species, the largest will then change into a male. So there are many of them where the females will often be colored a little bit more drab or even kind of polka dotted, not really gorgeous. And then the males will be this just crazy watercolor palette of blue and pink and mauve and splashes of yellow, and they're just, you can't take your eyes off them. They're so incredible. The male will have staked out a particular territory and will have a harem of females in there. And so he will swim the perimeter of his territory, and if another of the same species, another male of the same species tries to enter his territory, the first thing that the parrotfish will do will be to raise their dorsal fin, the fin on their back, and often there'll be a splash of yellow also against a bluer background, and so it's a warning, hey, you've just entered my territory, back off. And often that will chase the fish away, but sometimes they'll get into conflict, and so they'll chase each other around. The color plays a role in keeping fish from having to engage or waste energy in conflict when they can just flash who they are and how big they are and pick up on a visual cue, and it's understood by the less dominant fish. My favorite local blue? The blue on the fringes of Valella, by the sea sailors. These little gorgeous planktonic colonial organisms that come sailing in when the winds are right. People might have seen them. I think it was last year we had a big, huge bunch of them on all of our beaches at the end of the summer. They're organisms that live mostly out in the open sea, and they're about maybe 4 centimeters diameter, and they have a disc and then this sail that sticks up out of the water so they float just to the surface. And when the wind is right, they totally sail just like a perfectly rigged sailboat going into the wind. 50% of them have a sail that is tilted a little to the left and 50% a little bit to the right, and they'll go different directions so that all of them don't end up on the beach if there's a certain big windstorm event. It's an evolutionary cool quirk. And so they are actually related to jellyfish, but they're not jellyfish. They're hydroids, and they're colonial hydroids, and so many different individuals to make one organism. And they just float around, and they have little feeding polyps that fish in the surface for little zooplankton, and they just sail around and look blue.
My favorite blue in nature. What is my favorite blue in nature? I'm terribly fond of blueberries. You know what it is? I have a ring that is made out of azurite, and azurite is a copper-based ore. And it's this glorious kind of cerulean blue. I have to say that the ring on my finger, which is an azurite ring, is my favorite local blue. There are several species on our coast, fish species, that have bluish green or sometimes just blue flesh, which changes color when it's cooked, changes to white. And the question has arisen as to, why do they have that? Nobody knows. So the fishes that have them are lingcod sometimes, which is a reef fish, and then cabezon sometimes, but more often than lingcod. Turns out the cabezon and lingcod are at least distantly related to each other, so maybe the same phenomenon is going on in both species. Several hypotheses have been erected. One is that, these things maybe they eat crabs, and crabs have blue blood, and they have blue blood because their blood is not iron-based, it's copper-based. So the idea is, they're ingesting a lot of copper, maybe it's getting in their flesh, which is, I guess, possible. And indeed, cabezon eat a lot of crabs, but lingcod don't tend to eat a lot of crabs. So, I don't know about that one. The other theory is that the blue color is a byproduct of the production of bilirubin, which is also copper-based and is a metabolic byproduct in animals. And it may be that for some reason these animals are producing a lot of bilirubin and it's getting secreted in their muscle. Now, why they would do that, as far as I know, ain't nobody knows. Interestingly, and this shows you the power of marketing, I knew a guy named Scott Boley who ran a fish market in Port Orford, I believe, Oregon. And for a long time, people would not eat or would not buy lingcod with this blue-green flesh. And he started pushing it how exotic it was. And eventually people were asking for the blue-colored meat over the white color. And he could actually sell the blue stuff for more per pound than he could the white, which just tells you what a bunch of goobers we are, if nothing else.
My favorite local blue bivalve in nature would be some of the blue-eyed scallops. So there's many species of scallops, which most people think of as something on a dinner plate, but the organism itself is pretty spectacular and has many species have a whole series of eyes across the outer part of the shell on the body. And many of these organisms have blue eyes. And I'd have to say those are spectacular and not very well known. So why do scallops have eyes? This is a really fun question that we've been studying a long time. Bivalve mollusks are interesting in that they have no brains. So when you think about eyes not hooked up to a central processing unit or a brain, it's a really interesting question. How do they work? Why do they work? Why are they even there? To get to the most basic question, how do they work? Well, they actually are sensing a variety of things in the habitat around them. And scallops in particular have been examined in experimental conditions where they have essentially shown scallops food TV. In the case of scallops, they are filtering out plankton, gallons and gallons of water every day. So plankton TV is shown to scallops, some video with nothing in the water column, and then some video with actual plankton in the water column. And the animals can actually pick that up. And they've also done that in various scenarios of adding different types of food sources in with the scallops. And they actually see, they can see and also feel plankton in the water. So they actually open up. So you've heard of clamming up. So the clams actually open when they're exposed to food. So we think they can see that. The reason for blue eyes in scallops is totally beyond my realm of expertise. I don't believe that they're pigmented. I think it's actually reflective.
A pigment is a chemical compound or a molecule that absorbs certain wavelengths of light and reflects others. Natural pigments such as melanin, for example. Melanin absorbs many of the wavelengths of light, and that makes things appear very dark, such as black or brown. The problem with blue is those pigments that produce the color blue are very, very rare. In animals, almost all of that blue coloration that you see is structural. It's still light being reflected, but it's light that's being reflected off of certain structures, as I mentioned, such as feathers or scales, but often off little tiny microscopic particles that are either letting reds and yellows pass, or in some cases maybe absorbing them, but reflecting off that blue, so you get the blue coloration. And we have the structural coloration in amphibians, in reptiles, in mammals as well. Some of our most common reptiles are the western fence lizards, Scoloporus occidentalis. And you may have noticed, if you watch fence lizards, that the top of their body, their dorsum, is dark and drab and kind of blends into the environment. If they lift themselves up on their legs, they may expose to you their blue chin or the blue sides of their bellies. And they're called blue-bellied lizards. That's their common name because of this blue patches. This again has to do with sexual selection. The males attract females with their blue colors and display to the females and display to other males how strong they are based on their blue coloration. But this is a structural color in these lizards.
One thing that I'm going to bring up to you, so there's a number of marine snails that are pelagic. They actually live in the water, and the ones I'm thinking of live on the ocean surface, and they actually cruise along the ocean surface, and they eat jellies for a living. And there's several of these organisms that are blue. I mean bright blue. And one of them is shelled, a shelled pelagic animal, which in itself is pretty amazing, and it has a really beautiful sort of lavender blue color in its shell, and it keeps its shell up on the ocean surface by creating a raft of bubbles. So it makes a bubble raft. It looks kind of like bubble pack. There's the Glaucus apistobranchs. They look totally like aliens that dropped in from outer space. I can't describe them any other way. They're bright blue and have kind of weird arm-like things, and they float along the ocean surface.
When we talk about color, we are talking about it from a very limited perspective. Our eyes are so limited, and many organisms actually see wavelengths of color that we have no concept of. Just to keep in mind that what we see when we see color is something that many organisms are seeing on a really, really different realm.
Recently, what was interesting to me, one of the co-authors of this volume in Australia had been sent an email from a woman researcher in Ecuador of a two-spot octopus in Ecuador that the fishermen are catching. And Mark in Australia put me in contact with this woman, and it ended up that when I saw the photographs, the blue is just a simple little blue ring, not little tiny rings in it. So it's just sort of like a straight line, which indicates to me that she has a new species down there that has not been described.
Why should we care about biodiversity? That's actually a question that comes up a lot, in that humans are most concerned about their survival. Why does it matter that we have large numbers of other organisms along with us? Well, we're all part of the same ecosystem. Humans, while we've altered the ecosystem, we're still very much part of it. And if we destroy certain organisms, then that's actually to the detriment of the ecosystem and to our detriment. We want to keep every organism we can on this planet.
You've been listening to Biology Blues, edited by Owen Duncan and featuring the voices of Dr. Milton Love of the Marine Science Institute, Drs. Michelle Paddack and Jennifer Maupin of Santa Barbara City College, and Drs. Eric Hochberg and Paul Valentich-Scott of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. Our music is by the U.S. Army Blues, Go to 80 and the Uwe Schenk Band, the Skidmore College Orchestra, Scott Joplin, Marcel Minga, the Bruce Arrizabalaga Quintet, Peter Gresser, Komiku, Karina Galanyan, and Lloyd Rogers. Thank you for listening. Please don't poke the octopus.